Okay. That's me. No problem. You probably want to forge checks here.
That's right.
Everything cool? Okay, we're going to start now. Yeah, if you really want to, yeah, you have to record. So, welcome to the October program of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. And before we begin the program, I have a few announcements. First of all, I have my cheat sheet. Our membership drive has started. We've already had some people register, which is great. If you know anybody who wants to join, who isn't a member, if they join now, they're good for all next year. Our membership year runs from January 1st to December 31st. So these would be free months for new members. And anybody who renews now is covered for next year. And we're also looking for more volunteers because Evelyn, were you one of the original founders? No, so everybody sort of either aged out or moved from the originals, and we always replace ourselves. Michael is gone, replaced by Wayne and Jim, who can't be here tonight. I came in, then Tony. I'll introduce the board in a second, but we're looking for new people, so if you want to volunteer for some of the things that we do, I'm planning to put the job descriptions in our next newsletter. And so anyway, I did say Wayne and Jim are our co-presidents, and they couldn't be here tonight because they're having health issues, so I'm here. Our other members of the board who are here, Todd Miller is our program scheduler, and he's in the back. Has wonderful programs lined up for next year. His associate is Toby Chapman on that committee. Tony Indovina is our email coordinator and spends lots of time. Let's see, Audrey, I'm not sure of your title, audio-visual manager?
Member of the board.
And member, yeah, all of these people are members of the board. Our membership coordinator is Stanley Klein. Evelyn is our treasurer. Dr. Jean Binstock is another board member. Our new board member is Charles Suckup, who's not here tonight, but he's a city archivist, so we're expecting him to help us with a lot of research. He's already done some research for us on the Neil Log House, so very helpful to have him on board. And Janine Michael, is that right? No, Michael.
Oh, Michael.
Yeah, is our webmaster. So our next speaker, Mark Verostek, I knew I was going to get it wrong, is his hobby is going around the city photographing the city of Pittsburgh's seal, wherever it appears. And that's going to be really interesting because he showed us some of the slides he has, and this seal appears everywhere, so that should be an interesting speech. Excuse me. Okay, so few things about some events coming up that are exciting. This coming weekend, the owner of the Kerner House on Negley Avenue, the one with the little putti, has graciously offered to have a weekend of Henry Kerner events, and everybody's welcome to come. Henry Kerner is he's a noted artist, known worldwide. There's a house tour on Saturday and Sunday that you can sign up for on our website, Squirrel Hill Historical Society website, and the house is going to be full of the different phases of Henry Kerner's artworks. So I've seen them, they're spectacular. So if they can do a house tour. There's a movie at the Manor on Friday night that was produced by Henry Kerner's son Joseph. And if you know of any college students If they can do walk-in, I think $5 charge, walk in and see the movie. Everybody else who has graduated from college, it's a little bit more, but it's definitely going to be an event to see Manor Theater. Afterwards is a reception at the Silk Elephant. Then there's the house tours the next day, and the next day there's a free lecture at the JCC, but you do have to register for that. So anyway, that's going to be a highlight of the social season, this Henry Kerner event.
To say again, all the times for all those events are, click the button on the homepage of our website.
It's right on our homepage of Squirrel Hill Historical Society. Toby Chapman, I introduced the board before you came in. He's another board member. So happening that same weekend is something that, I forget, one of you mentioned is the Historic Pittsburgh Fair at Carnegie Library, main Oakland building. Second floor, it's going to be lots of historical societies. Rick Seaback's going to be there. There's going to be panel discussion, I think scavenger hunt. So that's also and I've worked that event. I don't know if you've been there before. It's
we were there.
yeah. So it's really interesting networking with all the historical societies and historical associations in Pittsburgh. So that's from 1 to 4 on Saturday in Oakland. Is Beth isn't here. Okay, on the back table, there are handouts for the Kerner event. There's handouts for, Beth Rourke is involved in gravestone studies, and I think it's November 4th, Todd. She was going to come and just say a few words, probably couldn't find a parking space. Is that November 5th?
Saturday.
It's going to be a conference about, believe it or not, people do study gravestones and the different gravestones from like early America all the way up till modern times. But this is a conference that's going to be held in Pittsburgh for the first time. Usually it's in the eastern part of the state. So she's encouraging that everybody to come who's interested in gravestones. Which I am, by the way, so I'm going to be going. So let's see. If you're wondering about the calendar, the Squirrel Hill calendar, that's in production right now. You'll be able to buy it at Little's, Riverstone, or you can order it from Shook. And if you are looking for a holiday gift, and there's Jim and Tom are going to be selling their books. We have some of our books for sale, so they do make good holiday books if you haven't, holiday gifts if you haven't bought one yet. I think that's everything on my list. Is there anything that any of the other board members, Audrey? Oh yes, Audrey. I'm sorry, forgot.
They, you want me to?
Yeah.
The documentary film about the Tree of Life incident made by Trish Adlesik is premiering on the worldwide premiere is on October 26th, which is a Wednesday, at 9 p.m. on HBO and HBO Max, and some members of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society appear in the film,
Like you.
including me. Thank you.
It's a good film.
And Todd,
Yes.
Wednesday the 26th, 9 p.m. HBO.
Thank you, Audrey, and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here in person or on Zoom. I'm Todd Miller, the program coordinator at the Squirrel Hill Historical Society, and at this time it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, which are Tom Powers, Jim Wudarczyk, co-authors of the Allegheny Arsenal Handbook, which is for sale in the back of the room following their presentation. The book commemorates the 160th anniversary of the explosion of the Allegheny Arsenal, which rocked Pittsburgh on September 17, 1862, and tragically claimed the lives of 78 civilians. Tom is the president of the Lawrenceville Historical Society and editor of its newsletter. He holds an MFA from Penn State University and is the principal author of the book Portrait of an American Community, O'Hara Township, PA, which was published in 2008. Jim is a board member of the Lawrenceville Historical Society and the former president of the society. His first book on the subject, Pittsburgh's Forgotten Allegheny Arsenal, was published in 1999. He writes widely on history and is the co-author of the Lawrenceville Historical Society's 3 books. At this time, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Tom Powers and Jim Wudarczyk. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Helen and Todd. Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tom and I want to thank you for coming out tonight, and we want to introduce you to the Allegheny Arsenal. It was a military installation that played a very key role in the history of the Pittsburgh community, as well as the national affairs of our country. Sadly, it is a shamefully neglected landmark. 5 years ago, Tom Powers came to me and said, "It's about time that we update your 1999 book, Pittsburgh's Forgotten Allegheny Arsenal." Since 2012, Tom and I have collaborated on a number of lectures and articles on a variety of historic subjects. We never tackled a book together, and if Tom ever calls you, don't answer the phone. I want to say that Tom is a fantastic illustrator and a meticulous researcher. Since both of us have been collecting more and more information since the publication of my book in 1999 and our presentation to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Arsenal explosion, it only made sense that we should pool our efforts and publish a new book. However, both of us thought that this book would be about 150 pages and take about 6 months to produce. 5 years later, it was over 340 pages with scores of pictures and illustrations and numerous sideline stories. As we were writing this book, you might say the book actually took on a life of its own. And we were very fortunate to have Michael Krause, who is the curator of Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Museum in Oakland, write the introduction to the book. If you know Michael Krause, you know that he has a fantastic image in the historical community. His reputation is simply outstanding. He wrote, "This book for the first time pulls together the complete history from 1814 to the present with well-researched text and copious illustrations." And Todd, I do want to correct you on one thing. This book is just not about the 1862 explosion. It traces the entire history of the Allegheny Arsenal, because the Arsenal did have a life before the Civil War, during the war, and after the war. And there were some events that commemorate the Allegheny Arsenal that even took place well into the 20th century. Okay, the main reason that we wrote this book was to keep together the memory of the Allegheny Arsenal, because as I said, this is a shamefully neglected landmark. We were not the first people to attempt to try to preserve the memory of the Allegheny Arsenal. By this slide, you can see that the first person was Charles Morris Stotts. In the 1930s, he made a series of detailed drawings about the remaining buildings, and he also took pictures of the buildings that were still standing. The middle picture shows a man by the name of John Carnprost. We dedicated the book to John, and we dubbed him the Apostle of the Allegheny Arsenal. In the early 1960s, he wrote a series of articles about the 1862 explosion for Gun Report magazine. Afterwards, he gave a number of presentations and lectures on the subject of the Allegheny Arsenal, and until he died a few years ago, John was an avid researcher of the subject. Then we have a man by the name of Mr. Joseph A. Borkowski, who was an early historian in Lawrenceville and an early ethnic historian for Pittsburgh. Joe really was my mentor. And I have to point out that if it wasn't for Joe, I probably wouldn't have any interest in local history. But Joe was instrumental in saving some of the historic stones from the demolished Allegheny Arsenal gatehouse on Butler Street. And he took those stones and had them placed in Arsenal Park, where they were, we hope will be preserved for posterity. Lastly, we have my book, Pittsburgh's Forgotten Allegheny Arsenal. This book came out in 1999. When I started researching the Allegheny Arsenal in 1980, I was shocked to find that there was not a single chronological history of the Allegheny Arsenal to be found anywhere in the city of Pittsburgh. The book really was an outgrowth of my 1981 manuscript that I compiled for the Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania. Manuscript was 50 pages, and it was titled Decision to Destroy, a Study of the Fate of the Allegheny Arsenal. Now I'd like to turn the next part over to Tom.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I got too many things in my hand right now, but let's go to our next slide. And we'll start at the beginning. Very beginning of the Arsenal starts at the shores of the Allegheny River and is noted on this 1815 map. Now, there's a couple things that are of interest here. First of all, you should know that I didn't find this map until late in our research, so it's in the appendix of the book. But it is very significant in that it shows the very first building. In fact, there's only one structure in the Arsenal area, and that is what would be this storehouse building. It's set at an angle, and it's set at an angle because at one point there was a stream running down the mountainside to the river, or to this back channel, and that's why it was at this angle to make use of that stream. Subsequently, by 1830, that stream has disappeared, or it's piped under, and the rest of the Arsenal is built along a grid pattern, which we'll see later. And this is 39th Street in Lawrenceville. This is 40th Street in Lawrenceville, no bridge there yet. And this is Butler Street. This other stream that runs through here is another significant one, 2-mile run, which we cover, but for the most part it's off of the Arsenal property, but it is a significant run, and like most streams in our area, it's now all underground or it's going through pipes. So our the building itself was there until about somewhere in the around 1970 when it was finally torn down. It was a pretty sturdy building, and unfortunately I don't think people realized how important the building was in the history of the Arsenal. To them it was just a rundown old storehouse. So unfortunately we no longer have it. The ad we see here is the first ad that calls for people, stonemasons especially, to come help build the Arsenal, and that's dated August 1st, 1814. Now, one of the there is a lot of as the Arsenal went up, we had commandants running the place, and one of the more interesting commandants was this fellow. His name is Sylvester Churchill, and he bears a striking resemblance to another Churchill.
Sure does.
The story here is he was the Arsenal commander when the Marquis de Lafayette visited the Arsenal in 1825. In fact, you could say that during that period, the main attraction in Pittsburgh was the Arsenal. The rest of it was just a little town, not much industry going on, and the Arsenal was an attraction that brought in not only a personage like Lafayette, but also President James Madison. that also visited the area. And in Churchill's time, he was, when he came on, he was mainly an artillery specialist, and he was later on distinguished himself in the Battle of Buena Vista in 1847. At the start of the Civil War, Churchill served as the Inspector General of the Regular Army for 20 years, and he retired in 1861 due to ill health. Now, the resemblance here was noted by his family member. She would have been a great-granddaughter. Her name was Anne Coleman, and she was married to a U.S. ambassador to Switzerland, Mr. Harrison, Ambassador Harrison. And she sent the photo of this, her ancestor, which actually this is right out of the Library of Congress. She sent that photo to President Roosevelt, noting the resemblance. Roosevelt passed it on to Churchill, and he had to admit that there must be some Churchills here in America. And in fact, there is a bunch of relatives that still are in the New England area. They've done DNA research, and there seems to be a connection. Now I'm going to turn it back to Jim here, and he's going to tell you about another important commandant, Rufus Baker. We got too many. Tell you what, could you all hear me during that well enough? I'm going to skip the microphone myself. Jim, you can hold on to that. And tell us about Rufus Baker.
Rufus Baker is probably one of the more interesting commandants of the Allegheny Arsenal. He served from 1828 until 1838. And he was very instrumental in making recommendations for the improvement of leather goods and other military accoutrements. It is during his administration that they begin to call the U.S. Arsenal near Pittsburgh, they begin to call it the Allegheny Arsenal. And again, I will turn this over to Tom.
You hold on to the mic. Here's another fellow who was a commandant, and it was a very important one in the history of the U.S. military. Thomas Jackson Rodman actually came to the Arsenal in the 1840s, right fresh out of West Point. And as a young lieutenant, he distinguished himself on his experiments in munitions and artillery. And he came up with a process called the Rodman process, which you could cast huge guns without them cracking apart when fired. This photograph here is what do we call this? A mock-up, not quite a mock-up, but it's a facsimile. That's better. Of the gun, true to size, and it's at in the ground floor of the Heinz History Center. In fact, this gun was so famous that a certain science fiction writer, Jules Verne, picked up on it, and it was the inspiration for his story From the Earth to the Moon. This is a tear sheet from the book in the French language, and unfortunately the guy who illustrated the canon got everything wrong, other than it's kind of big, but the 20-inch Rodman gun that we see there is even bigger than this shows, and it wasn't wrapped in iron rings to hold it together. It didn't need to have those rings. It could, because of the casting method, it could hold its own. The other mistake that they made in the French edition is they called him La Colombiad Rodmar instead of Rodman. But nevertheless, he was quite an influence on, and his munitions or armaments were quite a inspiration for early science fiction.
Okay. Okay, one man that deserves note at the Allegheny, that served at the Allegheny Arsenal in the early 1850s was Josiah Gorgas. While he's stationed at the Allegheny Arsenal, he really doesn't make an impact on the institution itself. However, it was his training at the Allegheny Arsenal that would prepare him for a job that he had later in life. That job was as Chief Ordnance Officer for the Confederate States of America. At the end of the American Civil War, the Confederacy ran out of men, and ammunition, but they ran out of men and food, but they never ran out of guns and ammunition. And it's all because of Josiah Gorgas. There's an overlooked incident at the Allegheny Arsenal that took place in October 1861. The newspapers were livid when matches were found among gunpowder, and they accused the Commandant, John Symington, of failure to act. This guy doesn't care if he blows up the arsenal. This guy doesn't care if they blow up Lawrenceville. He doesn't even care to blow up the whole city. So after repeated warnings, John Symington fires 200 boys and will replace them with girls. When we talk about boys, we are talking about a male who is between the ages of 12 and 22 who works for boys' wages. So the term boys refers to a wage scale. So you could be, like I said, between 12 and 22. And what happens? Well, the same newspapers that were livid that John Symington was not taking any action, they said it was terrible what John Symington did by firing 200 boys. And they accused him of a wanton display of arbitrary power. So you can see John Symington can't win.
Okay, now we're going to get back into the event that everybody knows about. We got a question there?
I just saying, is that because they thought girls were less likely to smoke?
Oh yeah, good girls do not smoke.
Okay.
So that eliminates the problem of matches. Girls were used at other arsenals. They had smaller fingers, and this is very tedious, meticulous work, rolling cartridges and loading cannonballs. They're like Claymore mines. They'd have a round ball and a lot of little mini balls in them. So you need very small hands to do that kind of precision work.
They
Yes.
were probably paid less too.
They were paid on a scale. You had to produce a number of cartridges. So whether you were male or female, you had your requirements, and if you didn't live up to them, you didn't get paid. That was simple as that. Girls were probably making about 5 cents an hour. That was pretty good in those days.
So let's, getting back to, and speaking of girls, probably one of the biggest discoveries we made in our research was this photograph right here. This is of, originally her name is Fridolina Neckermann. Her father was the master mechanic at the Allegheny Arsenal, an immigrant from Germany. And she, in various census and records, changed her name to Lena and also used Melinda, probably Fridolina being a little bit too weird for American sensibilities. But this is the only photograph we have of one of the victims of the Allegheny Arsenal explosion. And she was in room number 1 when the roof caved in after the explosion. I'm not going to go into detail on the explosion because we have a little animation that gives you an idea of what happened during the event, and I have to launch this. The explosion happened. This is our recreation of the laboratory and the side building, which is, we call the L-shaped building, which housed the steam engine that heated the lab. And Joseph Frick, the wagon driver, brought in gunpowder to the sort of the manufacturing end where they make the cartridges, and whether it was a horse's hoof or the wagon wheel hitting spilled gunpowder on the road, whatever it was, within minutes, it leveled the entire operation. And again, it's still, it was the largest civilian disaster during the Civil War. The final count is 78 victims, 71 of them are young girls. And that's the list of the victims. Again, there's a lot more detail we can go into this, but that's a whole other lecture on its own. But we cover that well in the book. Now our next slide has more videos. And one of the experiments we did, which we nicked from this fellow, Hickok 45 has a YouTube site where he talks about armaments and all kinds of weapons. And he did an experiment back in 2010 of gunpowder. And it was showing the difference between the gunpowder we're used to, which is called smokeless powder, and that was invented in 1895. And subsequently, anything you see in the cowboy movies is pretty much using that kind of powder. But it's not what the powder they used in the Civil War. So here's what happens when you light up smokeless powder. And you'll see that truly it is smokeless and it burns at a slow pace. So if you're setting a charge that's going to blow up the mine or the encampment of the enemy, you have enough time to watch the trail of gunpowder burn until it hits the its barrels and really goes off. But that's what we're used to today. But that's not what they had during the Civil War. What they had during the Civil War was black powder, which ignites quite differently. And you'll see that he's going to, has a trail of smokeless that's going to set off the Civil War era black powder, so he has time to get away, and here's why. It goes up and it goes up fast and it goes up high. And that's how the gunpowder went from the road to the porch and ignited the barrels that were on there. So this was an experiment that we had to do, and it made it quite evident as to the reason for that explosion. Now,
Yes, excuse me, Tom, question.
sure.
So just a quick question, did anybody survive that were in either one of these buildings?
Yes.
About half the people survived.
Yeah.
There were
Once the-
153 people working in the building, 78 are killed. And about another at least 12 were badly injured.
Yeah, once the explosion went off at the first building, most of the deaths are in those compartments that were in that one wing of the laboratory. And that gave everybody else time to get out. And there was a couple rooms that weren't in use at the time. So a lot escaped, but most of the fatalities happened in that one section. I have a slide later, if we have time, that shows you the complete breakdown of that laboratory. But here we're going to talk about post-Civil War. The question was, is the arsenal necessary? I mean, there's nobody on the border of Pennsylvania that's ready to attack us anymore. So James Scott Negley, who was a general during the Civil War, but he later got elected to Congress as a U.S. representative, and he proposed a bill to eliminate the arsenal as not being of use. Arsenal commandants Robert Whiteley and later James Riley argued vociferously in the newspapers to save the arsenal, and it did remain in effect at least for another 50 years. But again, it became more and more useless as far as the U.S. government was concerned. So Negley, he also was interesting after he had proposed eliminating the arsenal. He wound up later defending it during the 1877 railroad riots. He was the head of the militia that went in and protected the city and calmed the city down after the strikers had chased the Philadelphia militia away. So again, from wanting to get rid of it to having to defend it is an interesting chain of events there. Now we have a second armaments genius aside from Thomas Rodman, and that's this fellow, Major. Actually, this is one of my favorite names, Adelbert Rinaldo Buffington. Kind of a fancy name, but he was from West Virginia. But he was involved in a number of ordnance developments. These include a steel field carriage for a breech-loading field gun, a rear sight for rifles, the Buffington sight, which went on the U.S. Army's first breech-loading rifle, the 1873 Springfield, a ramrod bayonet process for bluing the minor parts of small arms, a gas furnace for small forgings, and in 1893 he was co-inventor with William Crozier of the Buffington-Crozier disappearing carriage for coast defense guns. And this breakdown here gives you an idea of what a complex piece of equipment this was. The idea being, again, you load it from the breech, but after you fire it, the recoil from the fire moves the gun through its structure, moves it down out of sight from the wall, and ready to reload, and then crank it up in position again. So again, these are and also the other thing was that Buffington was the Arsenal commandant during those 1877 riots. Now, actually, I have an article coming out in the History magazine talking about the Arsenal becoming more of a museum than a working arsenal. And during the 19th century, a reporter from the Pittsburgh Commercial Gazette wrote that among the latter are a cannon fronting the entrance to the lower grounds that was captured from the Spanish in Florida. And I'm thinking it's possible this could be a photograph of it, but it was called El Desperado. And it was made during the reign of Charles III, King of Spain, who ruled from 1759 to 1788. The reporter mentioned that Commandant Riley had a case of muskets and ranging from heavy flintlock to from 1744 to the finest breech-loading rifle now manufactured. That would have been the Springfield rifle. And the collection was very impressive, but unfortunately between 1901 and 1902, when they decided finally to maybe close down the arsenal, the collection was spread out all over through the government facilities. But a good deal of the items wound up with the Western Pennsylvania Historical Society, some of which you can still see today and which we'll note to you later on in this talk. Now another item that we'll touch on briefly, we have another event that happened in the arsenal in that period. in September 10th, 1903, the Arsenal Commandant, Lieutenant Ralph Drury, and you know, you have an idea of the importance of the Arsenal by this time when you have a lieutenant as the commandant. Went out on the Butler Street entrance and out of the Butler Street entrance and ordered 2 privates to track down local use steel and copper roofing from the Arsenal buildings. And if that sounds somewhat familiar, they're still stealing copper today, so watch your pipes in your basement. But here the roofs were sheathed in copper, and they were still useful for a lot of underground contractors. One of the privates, Private Dowd, chased after a 19-year-old Bill Crowley near the Allegheny Valley Railroad Yard, which was right by the river next to the Arsenal. And Dowd, who was a veteran of the Philippine Wars, was evidently a crack shot, and he fired at Crowley's legs to disable him. But unfortunately, he hit a vein, an artery, excuse me, and Crowley slowly bled to death. The upshot of this episode was when Dowd shot Crowley, he was off the Arsenal property in the city. And so the city and the Army argued back and forth as to who had jurisdiction to try not only Drury, the commandant, but also Private Dowd. And both Drury and Dowd had to stay at the Arsenal for the next 4 years until they were finally exonerated in 1907.
And next, what we call this slide a presidential visit. In May 1909, President William Howard Taft came to Arsenal Park to dedicate the Dolly Madison Fountain. It was estimated that 10,000 people jammed into the park to catch a glimpse of their president. Now, in the entire history of Lawrenceville, there were 4 sitting presidents who came to the neighborhood and either visited the Allegheny Arsenal or came close to it. They were Monroe, Grant, Taft came twice, and Obama. Next slide we have here, we want to talk about the Bureau of Mines. In the waning days of the Allegheny Arsenal, the military leased some of its facilities to other government agencies. In the March 2021 issue of Historical Happenings, which is the newsletter of the Lawrenceville Historical Society, we carried a story about how the Bureau of Mines was actually created on the grounds of the Allegheny Arsenal. We reproduced the article in the book with additional photographs. And I have to admit that when I was researching the article initially for the newsletter, I hit a lot of roadblocks. I was very fortunate that I was able to tap into materials that both Tom found and at the time our Vice President Linda Kemmerling found. And I found additional information. And by taking all these bits and pieces, we were able to put together the entire story of the Bureau of Mines. Now, one great thing about having an organization like the Lawrenceville Historical Society is that if you're a researcher and you run into trouble, there are always other members you can turn to for help.
One interesting building that doesn't look like it's interesting is this building here. It's off of Penn Avenue. It's right next to the Marine Hospital, or what is now today the Clack Health Center. Allegheny County runs that center mainly for sort of help maintaining their experimental laboratories, and also places where people would get shots and so forth in the area. But this building here, which looks like an old stable, is actually a former munitions building, and we figured that it was, according to several maps we have, probably built circa 1840. and that would make it probably the county's oldest municipal building. Today it's used as a carpentry shop, but it's a carpentry shop that's well protected. If you'll notice these vaulted ceilings, the walls are at least 3 to 6 feet thick, and again, if you know, it's one of those cases, if you cut your finger off using the saw, no one will hear your screams. But it's an interesting building. There are talks now of moving the Clack Health Center and maybe doing something with it. But we'll hopefully be on in the planning, be able to monitor the planning stages to make sure they don't get rid of that building.
To commemorate the 150th anniversary of the disastrous 1862 explosion, and to honor the patriotic Americans who lost their lives on that fateful day, the Lawrenceville Historical Society teamed up with the Senator John Hines History Center and the Sons of the Union Veterans, and also the Allegheny Cemetery Historical Association, to present a number of events over the course of the following few months. And as a result of all these events, attention was drawn to what had happened 150 years ago. And for the first time, the Associated Press picked up on the story, and in newspapers across the country, the memory of those people who lost their lives that fateful day was actually honored. Now I understand Tom has one more slide on me.
Yeah, this is the a picture of the fountain that was on the parade grounds, and you'll notice that this cannon, well, you won't notice, but this cannon that we see here today in the front is actually now on display at the Hines History Center, right there on the 5th floor. So the next time you're there, you can visit a little piece of the Allegheny Arsenal.
So now you have it. The whole story of the Allegheny Arsenal was finally told in one book. We would greatly appreciate it if you would support the Lawrenceville Historical Society by purchasing a copy of the book. And for your kindness in allowing us to be here today, both Tom and I want to thank you and say, may God bless all of you. We have a question back there.
I think I heard you correctly. That last picture, the experimental lab, was Dr. Clack. Did you say that?
So it's the Clack Health Center.
Yeah,
There's 10 buildings on the complex.
Was it, do you know if it was Frank Clack who was?
Yes.
He was
Yes.
a veterinarian.
He was a veterinarian.
Yes.
He was the head of the Allegheny Health.
He actually had to file a complaint because they said you have to be a medical doctor, and he actually filed suit against the state because there was no state law prohibiting a veterinarian to hold the position. And as a result, he was successful.
He also had a wonderful sense of humor. My husband did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yes, couple of questions. One, was the Arsenal a single building or a complex of
Oh, it's a
buildings?
complex of buildings.
Actually, I
They
have
would
a slide
extend
here.
from what is now the railroad tracks. They call it the Allegheny River because it was a channel in the Allegheny River at the time, all the way to Penn Avenue, between 39th and 40th Streets. There were approximately 60 structures. Now, when we talk about structures, they could be small wooden sheds, they could be an outhouse that government kept track of all their structures, and there were probably a good 20 buildings that were either made of stone or brick, very substantial buildings. And the only problem was that the one they built in 1857 is the one that was made of wood, and that was the site of the terrible explosion.
Yeah, this is just a diagram, and we have several diagrams in the books as the Arsenal property changes and buildings are added or removed. But this is it. Again, there's 39th Street, there's 40th Street. Again, we still have the back channel here. This is Wainwright's Island, is the name of it. That was attached to the shore by real estate developers about 1873. But it was, and also 2 Mile Run, which I mentioned earlier, fed into that back channel. But these show the locations of the various buildings that we have photos of. So that's the reason I use this slide, as to show what was what. Now the ones that are in color are the ones that are still with us. There's our Clack Health Center building, and in fact this is another munitions building that was built in 1859, and that is also part of the Clack Health Center. And of course the main remnant of the arsenal, built around 1819, is this stone magazine. So the powder magazines are the things that were left over, and only one building, this officers' quarters, which was built in 1866, is still there.
Yes, sir.
I think I remember a news story from 4 or 5 years ago about some construction in this area where they found some Civil War
Cannonballs, right. In 1972, they actually found 1,250 of them. And at the time, the prevailing theory was that when black gunpowder gets wet and dry, it becomes more and more unstable and more volatile. And then several years ago, they found a huge catch, and then a couple of years ago, they found another 800.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're looking at well over 3,000 cannonballs that they had found. Andy Masick, who is the head of the Heinz History, Senator John Heinz History Center, proved that theory all wrong. He said that actually it's modern powder that sweats and is very dangerous. It's black powder, if it gets wet, it's useless, totally useless. And he showed that these cannonballs could actually be dropped from the top of the U.S. Steel building and wouldn't explode. You have to provide direct heat. Unfortunately, and Andy had the Marines willing to disarm these cannonballs and donate them to museums across the country. Unfortunately, the city of Pittsburgh says, get rid of them. They were taken to Fort Indiantown Gap and blown up. Yes, sir.
Before we finish with that, I will mention there is a kind of cannonball that can still be dangerous, and that is a naval cannonball, which is watertight. And there is a story that I put in that section of our book, where what do we call these, a Civil War
relic hunter
actually was working on one of those cannonballs. He didn't realize or didn't think that it was naval. Had his grinder out trying to smooth it down, and he suddenly disappeared.
He broke the seal and he threw a spark on the black powder. So again, you have to have direct heat. And with black powder, as we showed you, it doesn't take much to go up. Yes, sir.
Could you describe the importance of the armory during the Civil War until then?
Okay, yeah, it was considered one of the principal arsenals in the entire United States. And you have to remember, prior to the Civil War, as soon as the war's over, you disarm, you cut back your military, what have you. During the American Civil War, what had happened was, there's about 20,000 men enlisted in the United States Army at the time. Some of them go off to the South to fight, and Mr. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers, then he calls for 150,000 volunteers, and then he calls for another 500,000 volunteers. So in a very short period of time, we go from arming 20,000 troops to over 500,000. That's what, about 600,000 men. And so it comes to the arsenal, not only to provide them with guns and ammunitions, but also to provide them with all the accoutrements that they would need. They need leather goods, they need tents, they need food, they need wagons. And the Allegheny Arsenal did produce limbers, carriages, and caissons. They also produced a lot in the way of leather goods. They were loading cannon shells, they were loading paper cartridges for the muskets or the rifle muskets that they used at the time. So it was really important that you had these. And if they couldn't provide enough, they had to have subcontractors, and these subcontractors, they had inspectors at the Allegheny Arsenal just to make sure that everything matched whatever the government requirements were. Because if you remember in the beginning of the Civil War, there was a lot of shoddy stuff being sold to the government, and the taxpayers got ripped off left and right. Not to mention these poor guys are marching, their uniforms fall apart, and their shoes fall off their feet. So it was very important that after that episode, that whatever they did, we got quality products for our troops. Yes, sir.
Two questions regarding houses. Do you know where the commandants lived? Are any of the houses still standing?
No, they were demolished. Matter of fact, the commandant's house was actually demolished on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the Civil War. So you want to talk about a kick in the teeth, you got another one right there.
Yeah, this is Butler Street right here. This is the commandant's house. And actually this was still, this house was still in use up until 1960.
Yeah, 61.
Yeah, that was the...
They demolished it.
Yeah. And that was the Rom's...
Rom's, they owned all that property, and they wanted to convert it into warehousing because they were in the food distribution business and other businesses.
Well, they
like
were
that.
already warehouses.
Yeah.
Yeah, from 1980.
I meant they're warehousing
Yeah.
their products.
Okay.
And then the second part, sorry, real
Yes.
quick, is are there any houses still left in the neighborhood that were adjacent to where the explosion happened that might have been damaged but are still standing today?
There is one that I know of for sure on 40th Street.
Yeah.
As you go up, it's several houses right off of Davison Street. We know that that house was there at least in 1840. When John Symington leaves the Allegheny Arsenal, he's a very sick man. And he left the Arsenal, and I understand that for a very short period of time, he stayed there in that house with his family. But it was not connected to the Allegheny Arsenal.
So you don't know if it was, I'm just thinking about the explosion might damage the neighborhood.
Oh, I'm sure there were hundreds of houses that were damaged at the time. The Lawrenceville Presbyterian Church was on 39th Street, midway between Penn Avenue and Butler Street, and all its windows were blown out.
Actually, I'll go, just to, I don't know if you'll be able to see this. Yep, there you go.
I wanted to ask about that picture.
But the church is, yeah, it's off, this is St. Augustine's, and this was in 1909. The Presbyterian church is just up the street on 39th Street.
What's this woman first?
You showed a picture before of arches. There, that second one,
This
the third
gatehouse?
one. Yeah, that one. Now, is that no longer standing?
No, they tore that down in 1947.
What, was that the
Yeah.
entrance to the arsenal?
Yes, it was built in 1857.
It's architecturally, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's actually part of that. It's sort of was made to mimic the gatehouse in Allegheny Cemetery. So it's a later build. It doesn't really fit in with the original design of the arsenal, but it's the building that most people relate to the arsenal just because it's castle-like. But yeah, there was also in our book, there were plans to move it stone by stone into Arsenal Park, rebuild it, and make it an office sort of restroom area. But unfortunately, money was tight during the World War II, and that never came to pass.
Yes, ma'am.
It seems like around this would have been around the time that Stephen Foster was living in Lawrence.
No, Stephen Foster, really, he's born there in 1826, and his father's in bankruptcy. With Stephen Foster's probably about a year and a half old, and the family moves, and they never moved back to Lawrenceville. His brother Henry did, but that was when he was an adult. But as far as the father or Stephen, Stephen Foster was born there, but he never wrote any of his music. Okay, let's take this gentleman here. His hand's getting sore from being up in the air so long.
Yeah, thank you. When the Bureau of Mines was formed in Lawrenceville, was the Allegheny Arsenal, was that still open? Did they
It was
exist
still
at the same time?
open, but it's really not functioning very much as an arsenal. Small contingent of soldiers just to maintain the grounds. And again, the government wants to get rid of it, but then something happens and it's called World War I. And the government decided that they needed a warehousing facility in Pittsburgh. They owned the land at the Allegheny Arsenal. They demolished many of the historic buildings and they put up warehouses that for many years were called the Arsenal Terminal Buildings. And they were just demolished recently by a housing complex that's down there by Millhouse.
Yeah. Incidentally, we have a map of exactly which buildings the Bureau of Mines owned or ran their experiments out of in our book.
Were they also part of, were they buildings at Allegheny?
They were
Arsenal?
formerly from the Arsenal, yes.
And what's interesting about, they were testing coal dust and the explosive nature of coal dust. And one of the experiments they did was in an underground bunker that had steel doors. And the explosion was so great, it blew the steel doors off. Fortunately, nobody got hurt. It blew up all the lamps in the Allegheny Arsenal complex and destroyed something like 300 windows in the neighborhood.
Here's that building that I talked about early on, the first building, the storage building. That was used for, they had all kinds of pipe and equipment in there running their experiments. Here's another experiment here. I believe this again is for testing for mine gas or the coal dust. And basically it's an explosion chamber. That's along Butler Street. And here you can see the gatehouse and the old Arsenal building.
Charlie?
Yeah, two things. One, President Grant's visit, which he was here at least 4 times. And
Grant came to Allegheny Cemetery in September 1869. He was actually trying to shore up the popularity of the newly formed Republican Party, his own image, and there was a big, the Germans were celebrating Humboldt, I believe it was,
yes,
yeah, and so they had a big
of his
birth, and they had a big celebration where West Penn Hospital would be in Bloomfield. And on the way back, Mayor Brush says to the president, oh, this is Allegheny Cemetery. And Grant was very good friends with General Alexander Hayes. They were buddies at West Point. They remained in contact all through till Hayes was killed in 1864 at the Battle of the Wilderness. So the president, as far as I can tell, he's traveling by himself. And he doesn't have Secret Service or anything like that. These 2 men are in a carriage, and he said, could you be so kind as to show me where Alexander Hayes' grave is? So the story is that the mayor takes Grant to the grave. Grant walked around the monument, read all the battles that his friend was in, sat on one of the inverted cannon barrels, and started to weep like a small child. And I guess when he received word that his friend was killed, he's running, the entire military operations of the wilderness. He couldn't show any emotions. And then when he realized the mayor's looking at him, he pulls himself together and says, could you do me one more favor? Take me to the home of Mrs. Hayes, because I want to pay her my respects. So I think, it's a totally different world today. When President Obama came to the robotics center right across the street, I mean, the security was so close, they didn't have any parades or anything. When Taft came, actually he dedicated the same day Rodolph Shalom Synagogue, right. And there's a huge memorial with the photograph and a lot of, it's like a museum of Judaism, and they do have about Taft coming for the dedication ceremonies. But 10,000 people show up in one spot, and they line the streets because they just can't wait to see their president. And I guess after the Kennedy assassination, kind of curtailed that kind of ceremony for the presidency. Yeah.
The second one is about the blocking of the cannon in 1860, and how many cannon and which, do we have any idea what they were? And they got as far as the city-county building today.
Well, they got down to the Monongahela Wharf, most of, or some of them. The protests started. What had happened was the Secretary of War told John Symington, here's your orders, you are to take 123 large Columbia cannons and you are to put them on a boat and you are to ship them to ports, to New Orleans, and then they're going to go to fortifications in the south that are still under construction. Well, the people of Pittsburgh were livid because they thought they were being robbed of all their armaments. And one of the newspapers says, hey, you want to stop it? Lay down in front of the cannons. If the commander can't ship them, he's relieved of his responsibility. And there's a massive protest, and there's actually a marker at the courthouse honoring this event. And they said the mayor convened a meeting on Christmas Day of all times. And while it's packed and people are yelling and screaming, and finally somebody says, hey, wait a second, does President Buchanan know what's going on? And everybody looks and says, well, I didn't tell him, did you tell him? Well, no, I didn't tell him. So somebody finally comes up with the idea of sending the president a telegraph and telling him what's going on. Buchanan is very angry, but he doesn't have the heart to fire anybody on Christmas Day. So John Floyd is on his way out. Shortly thereafter, there are a number of scandals involving John Floyd. Shortly thereafter, the president convenes a cabinet meeting, but conveniently does not invite Mr. Floyd. Floyd enters and he starts raising Cain with the president for not inviting him. The Secretary of the Interior, by Jacob Thompson, got up and says, I got that crooked cousin of yours in jail right now for stealing bonds from the Department of the Interior, and you're the next to go to jail. So John Floyd did the most sensible thing he could do, resigned and ran back to Virginia.
And later was defeated by Grant at Fort Donelson.
It was Fort Donelson's just a joke with the way they kept jumping. Nobody wanted to take the blame for losing the fort, so they kept transferring. Well, it's your turn to be commander. No, it's your turn. But John Floyd fought the one battle he fights, when he really doesn't fight it. He takes the boats and evacuates his troops and leaves the rest of the Confederate Army to be captured. So, a real nice guy to know.
Yeah, you know? Grant has some great opinions of him in his
Well, actually, we put
Who
that
was John Floyd?
quote.
John Floyd, he was
in our
Secretary
book.
of War.
We put that quote in our book, what he thought of Floyd's acumen as a Civil War general. The other thing is we have in that whole story, which again, that could be a separate lecture, but we have a picture of the boat that was supposed to take the cannons down the river, the Silver Way.
Okay.
So we found a picture of that in our book. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you know how that, the bottom building on the right was turned into a bathroom? And do you know how that was saved?
A bathroom?
Or not a bathroom, but
No, it's this
the
one where
bar
the
right here.
Stone magazine is.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So
That was added in around 1950, late 40s.
48.
Yeah. And they decided they needed a bathroom in Arsenal Park, so that's where they put it. That was really not in the original plans when they wanted to convert Arsenal Park. And again, a lot of the plans just were never implemented, but they are all in the book.
Yeah, we should also mention that we cover the guy who really formed Arsenal Park, Ralph Griswold, 1934 to, I think he was there till 45. But his initial plan for the Stone magazine was as a museum, which never came to fruition. Ralph Griswold, by the way, is one of the co-designers of Point State Park. So.
Yes, Ellen?
Someone told me a while ago that the cannon were taken by railroad to Wall to test.
They were taken to different places. They were actually taken as far as Ligonier. As the guns, they started testing them, as I understand, down around what would be the 62nd Street Bridge, and they would fire up the hill into what is Morningside.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's okay as long as it's country. But once you start any kind of development, and the guns are getting bigger and they fire further away, and the explosions are terrific, they decided to start taking them out to the Turtle Creek Pitcairn Wall area.
Yeah.
Then they actually took them as far as Ligonier, and they would actually put them on trains. But you had to test these cannons. And one of the things we learned while going through the book, there is a cannon in Arsenal Park. It is a Dahlgren 9-inch shell gun. Was it 8?
I think it's 9.
9-inch shell gun. It actually was cast at the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia. We don't know how they came to be here in Pittsburgh. We think that it may be after the Civil War they just rounded up the ordnance and they moved it to the Allegheny Arsenal.
Dumping shiploads of
Yeah.
armaments.
Or it could have been sent to Pittsburgh to test the durability of the metal, because we had testing devices that other places did not have. In any event, we just learned, because Andy Masick pointed out, that only on test guns did they stamp into the gun how many times it was fired. So it never saw combat. But it's an interesting piece of Civil War history.
We should also mention that the upcoming issue, which I have an article in, Andy Masick has a great story on the cannonballs that were found, as well as other munitions that fit that category.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is Arsenal School on land that was part of the Arsenal complex? Or is it just named
Absolutely.
for the complex?
Absolutely.
Arsenal School's right there.
Yeah. It extended all the way, like I said, from what is now the railroad tracks up to Penn Avenue, 39th to 40th Street. And the government just really didn't want the arsenal. So starting about 1900, they start parceling off land. Part of it went to the Treasury Department for the Marine Hospital, which we now know as the Clack Health Center, and run by the county. Part of it became a park for the city of Pittsburgh. Part became Arsenal School. Lower grounds in 1926 were sold at public auction.
Yeah, this photograph of this one warehouse was used as a school. That part of the land was given to the Pittsburgh Public Schools, and so they were already on this spot, and it wasn't until later that they developed the idea of putting a whole high school in there.
Any other questions? One more?
This is the last one, sorry. Is the wall around the park, do you know if that dates to the Arsenal?
Yes, absolutely. The original walls were on the lower part of the Arsenal. They were completed about 1828. And then when they would complete, they'd just keep working their way up the hill. I understand they were a little bit higher and they were capped with iron railings at one time. The walls themselves are in deplorable condition. And not too long ago, there was an illustrious plan by the Parks Conservancy to demolish the walls. Oh, keep little bits and pieces of them, so it become an open space. And when I heard that, I said, you want a war? You got a war. We had 1,800 patriotic Americans sign a petition and saying, back off, these walls are sacred. And all of a sudden, it captured the newspaper's attention and the powers to be back down. So,
And the walls be repaired.
they're talking about it. One of the things is when they repaired the walls back in the 1960s, they just took concrete and slapped it in. The old stone really requires more sand in the mortar mixture, and it allows it to allow the water to flow out easier. We're hoping that someday they will do that. But they've been talking about doing renovation in Arsenal Park. We had the fireworks there on June 25th because they said you can't have them on the 4th of July because effective July 1st, we are going to start on phase 1 of renovating the park. And here it is October 11th, and they still haven't done anything on it. And I thought, oh, they're starting today because I saw City of Pittsburgh Public Works down there. All they were doing was picking up weeds. So, you know. Okay, Helen, thank you, and thank you everybody for allowing us to be here.
And thank you very, very much. And anybody who wants to stick around and have more questions for Jim and Tom, please feel free.
Yeah, don't forget our
And oh
book.
yes, the book's back there. So thank you very much for coming.
And please take those forms, ask your friends if they're looking for Christmas gifts, keep us in mind.
And